the Honourable Virginia Bell AC found that while the member for Cook was the Prime Minister of Australia, he 1. had himself appointed to administer A. the Department of Health on the 14th of March 2020, B. the Department of Finance on 30 March 2020, C. the Department of Industry, Science and Energy and Resources on the 15th of April 2021, D. the Department of Treasury on 6 May 2021, and E. the Department of Home Affairs on 6 May 2021, and 2. did not inform A. the Cabinet, B. the relevant departments, C. the House of Representatives, or D. the Australian public about the additional appointments, and C. as found by the Honourable Virginia Bell AC, the actions and failures of the member for Cook 1. fundamentally undermined the principles of responsible government because the member for Cook was not responsible to the parliament and through the parliament to the electors for the department he was appointed to administer, and 2. were apt to undermine public confidence in government and were corrosive of trust in government, and 2. therefore censures the member for Cook for failing to disclose his appointments to the House of Representatives, the Australian people and the Cabinet, which undermined responsible government and eroded public trust in Australia's democracy. The principles of responsible government were fundamentally undermined. I quote again, "The lack of disclosure of the appointments to the public was apt to undermine public confidence in government." I quote again, "The secrecy with which the appointments had been surrounded was corrosive of trust in government." If we could unanimously determine that the conduct of Bruce Bilson fell short of the standards, how on earth can the multiple ministries, can question time after question time where we in fact did not know where portfolios had been allocated, how on earth can that not meet the standard? Question time is viewed as the most significant part of the parliamentary day when every member turns up. It's not a requirement that every member turns up, it is a convention. But we have to defend our conventions too. And the core of responsible government was breached with the multiple appointments.
That I was present each and every day at that dispatch box, Mr Speaker, to answer any and all questions in this House regularly directed to me as Prime Minister on all matters involving all portfolios that were the subject of the Bell inquiry and indeed all other portfolios. The suggestion that as Prime Minister I was not available to do so in this House, or that the opposition failed to ask such questions in those portfolios, is absurd and completely false. Had I been asked about these matters at the time, at the numerous press conferences I held, I would have responded truthfully about the arrangements I had put in place.
Order.
The recommendations of the Bell inquiry will appropriately remedy this deficiency in the future, and I support them.
I rise to support this motion because it is absolutely right that this House censure the member for Cook for undermining the basic principles of our system of government. And I say that even more so after the speech that we've just listened to from the member for Cook, because in all too familiar fashion the former Prime Minister has sought to obfuscate and hide his errors. Even now the member for Cook is failing to admit the errors that he made. He said in the course of that speech, extraordinarily, "If people had asked, I would have answered." I'll just repeat that. If people had asked, I would have answered. So apparently it's the fault of this House that these errors were made. Apparently it's the fault of this parliament that this misconduct occurred. Apparently it's the fault of the Fourth Estate that these errors occurred and this misconduct occurred. Says the member for Cook, if people had asked, I would have answered.
A censure motion like this is as rare as it is grave. The fact that it has become so necessary constitutes a profoundly sad moment in the life of our national parliament. But to ignore it would be to be complicit in saying, well, that was okay. This House of Representatives has a responsibility to declare its view on what occurred with these extraordinary actions by the former Prime Minister. I wake up every single day very cognisant of the honour that I have in serving as Australia's 31st Prime Minister. I'm also very aware of the responsibility that comes with it. I'm also very conscious of the power that comes with it. Power should never be abused. This was an abuse of power and a trashing of our democracy. And the Bell inquiry makes that so clear, so clear. For this Parliament to have an inquiry and then not respond comprehensively to it would not be it doing its duty. The explanation for the first two appointments by the former Prime Minister was what would happen if a minister becomes incapacitated in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. We all know, and I know as Prime Minister, that it is, as Virginia Bell has found, that an acting minister could be appointed, if needed, to quote the inquiry, in a matter of minutes. In a matter of minutes. The appointments were unnecessary. The last three appointments had little connection to the pandemic, according to the Bell inquiry, were made because of the former Prime Minister's view and concern that an incumbent minister might exercise his or her statutory powers in a matter with which Mr Morrison didn't agree. That is what the Bell inquiry found. The Pepper Levin determination was something that was there, but also FIRB decisions, the power to stop or undo foreign powers acquiring interest in Australian assets, or the power to strip people of their citizenship. And cast your mind back to the 21st of May, when the then Prime Minister made an announcement about the arrival of a boat, and text messages were sent to millions of Australians in direct contradiction to the guy who stood up at press conference after press conference and said that he would not talk about on-water matters. At the time that was done and authorised by the Liberal Party, that extraordinary attempt to distort an election result was the Prime Minister, but also someone who'd been sworn in with the authority to act in the Department of Home Affairs, which is why the then Minister has called for the member for Cook to resign from Parliament. The fact is that our democracy is precious. There's no room for complacency. We've seen overseas, including with the assault on the Capitol building in the United States, that we can't take our democracy for granted. The explanations that were put forward were described by Ms Bell as not easy to understand and difficult to reconcile with the facts. The implications were there in the Bell inquiry. There was a risk of conflict if different ministers wanted to exercise the same power inconsistently. Ms Bell confirmed the Solicitor General's view that the principles of responsible government were fundamentally undermined because the member for Cook, the then Prime Minister, was not responsible to the Parliament and through the Parliament to the electors for the department he was appointed to administer. It undermined public confidence in government. It was, according to Ms Bell, corrosive of trust in government. The public didn't know, according to the Bell inquiry, something it was entitled to know. And yet this morning I came here not certain as to whether I would speak. But I have to respond to the Prime Minister's comments, who has confirmed again that he just doesn't get it, the former Prime Minister. He said this morning he'd had conversations privately with my colleagues. It's not about Josh Frydenberg.
That's right.
It's about the people of Australia. That's who we're accountable to. Through this parliament, at this dispatch box, we ask questions about PEP 11. We ask questions about health, not knowing that the then Prime Minister was actually responsible and sworn in. The former Prime Minister flicked more questions to ministers than all previous 29 Prime Ministers. The former Prime Minister shut down debate at this dispatch box each and every time people attempted to make a contribution about the serious matters. And when he goes to the impact of COVID and the responsibility, I had that sense too as the Leader of the Opposition, which is why we on this side of the House now, when we sat there, took responsible decisions to not play politics, to vote for and to declare in advance of packages coming forward that even if our amendments were not successful, even if there were measures which we did not agree with, such as the rating of superannuation, we would not stand in the way, even though there was a political cost to that we were conscious of. But we understood our obligation to the national interest. This was not a one-man show. This was the Australian people who stood up and protected themselves, not just in the parliament, those people who stayed at home, people who got vaccinated, the heroes of the pandemic who went out there and worked with people who were sick. So all this unctuousness and self-congratulation we heard this morning should be dismissed. He came up with a different explanation today. If only he was asked to blame the media and everyone else. Why didn't we come in here and ask if he'd been sworn in as Treasurer or Finance Minister?
What's your day job?
It's just beyond comprehension that this parliament should be, as a whole, standing up and voting for this motion. The whole parliament. Because it began with measures like the former Deputy Prime Minister, who I have a lot of respect for, and he knows that. And I might speak beyond time here. The former Deputy Prime Minister was told by the Prime Minister's office then to not be transparent about whether he was acting Prime Minister in 2019. That is how these things begin. And I don't blame the former Prime Minister, Deputy Prime Minister, for being loyal to his Prime Minister. I respect that. But he should never have been asked to be put in that position. Nor should there have been a Cabinet committee of one. Nor should those people who were aware of this not declared. The former Deputy Prime Minister, the second one, Barnaby Joyce, was asked on Insiders why it was that he was aware over the PEP 11 decision and why he did not say something and speak up about this at the time. This was his response, and I quote the member for New England. "I had negotiated an extra minister, which we were not entitled to. I had another person on the ERC, which we were not entitled to. I negotiated more staff for the National Party, which we were not entitled to. If I pursued this, it was quite simple. He just took away the portfolio that we weren't entitled to and took us back to the number we were entitled to. He would have the portfolio back and we lose all power." On the 21st of August 2022. People had a responsibility to act. They didn't. It was a slippery slope that undermined the functioning of this parliament, that undermined our democratic institutions, that this House has a responsibility to act on. I think that the comments of the member for New England go, in his own words, to motivation why people weren't spoken about. I know that there's a range in different contexts. I've spoken about arrangements that were entered into that were not transparent. I was asked a question this week about the discussions I had with Senator Pocock and asked to be transparent about it, and I have been, as has Senator Pocock. These things are important. It's actually how our democracy functions. I cannot still conceive of the idea that, and this is why questions weren't asked, because it's impossible to conceive that a Prime Minister does not have the authority to have influence over their ministers. I hope I do, to be transparent about it. At the end of the day, I have that great honour of leading this quite extraordinary group of ministers that have been sworn in. I assure you I have not thought for a millisecond about being sworn in order to override them. But there's something else that's really serious, and this goes to the PEP 11. There are a range of ministerial responsibilities, including the responsibilities that the Minister for the Environment has, for example, but the Minister for Resources, the Minister for Immigration, a range of ministers have portfolio responsibility. The acts have been written very clearly so that it's not the minister in consultation with the Prime Minister or with someone else. They're written that way so that the minister can take account of all of the evidence that's before them and then make a decision that is their decision, that they own. When the PEP 11 decision was made, there was no transparency about the Prime Minister saying he was doing it as the Minister for Resources. The exact opposite occurred, and the Minister for Resources didn't say that he had been overridden. It was the Minister for Resources' job to do that. If the Prime Minister, and under the Liberal Party system, it's easier than under our system, which elects our ministry, but a Prime Minister who asks for a minister's resignation receives it without exception. I've never seen that not occur. And then they appoint someone else to that job. That's the appropriate course to take under the Westminster system. And if a decision's made that a minister feels that they can't, in all conscience, continue, in all good conscience, continue to serve, then they resign. And that happens under our system. It happened under the former government that I was proud to serve in. So I think that, and I'll conclude with this comment, and I thank the House for the extension. I'll conclude with this comment. I thought this morning we would see some contrition. Some. A semblance of contrition. We got none of that. We got hubris, and we got arrogance, and we got denial, and we got a former Prime Minister who, in spite of the fact that when we appointed, and there were a range of things that we could have done as a government, it wasn't a royal commission like occurred into former Labor leaders' activities of, for example, against former Prime Minister Gillard, and something that might have occurred or alleged was to have occurred a long, long time before she was in Parliament. That's what the former government did. That's what the former government did. There was none of that from us. None. None. We appointed a former High Court judge, Virginia Bell, to undertake an inquiry. We did that under the expectation that there would be cooperation with it, but the former Prime Minister chose to only talk to that inquiry through his lawyers, in spite of his public comments at the time that there would be full cooperation with it. This morning, what we saw was just a justification of his government's record. Now, some of that is quite rightly the subject of political debate, and we will agree on some of it and disagree on some of it. There are many things that the former government did to deal with the COVID pandemic that we supported wholeheartedly. There are other things that we think could have been done better. That's quite rightly the subject of political debate. That's not what is before the House today. What is before the House today is whether the former Prime Minister's actions in being given responsibility to administer a whole host of portfolios, which even after the first two came out as a result of him feeling it was okay to tell two journalists what was going on, is how the first two came out. Then there were further revelations, and we found through the Bell inquiry that he also considered being sworn in to administer the environment and water portfolios as well, an additional portfolio. Whether that was appropriate. Secondly, whether there should have been transparency about that. There should have been. There should have been. The former Prime Minister owes an apology not to people who he shared brekkie with at the Lodge. He owes an apology to the Australian people for the undermining of democracy, and that's why this motion should be supported by every member of this House.